Good day. Today we'll be looking at Module 7, which is legal frameworks, looking at international emergency response laws. Now, by way of module objectives, learners will be able to understand the role of legal frameworks in disaster and emergency management. We'll be able to identify key national and international disaster management laws and regulations, able to compare and contrast disaster management legislation in different countries and regions, including the USA, Canada, Australia, the UK, Nigeria, and the EU, European Union. At the end of this module, you're able to explain how legal frameworks establish responsibility, coordinate coordination mechanisms, and emergency powers. She will to analyze real-world case studies to evaluate the effectiveness of legal frameworks during disasters. By the end of this module, you're able to learn how to apply knowledge of legal systems to suggest improvement in disaster response and preparedness. Now, by way of introduction, effective disaster management relies not only on preparedness, response, and recovery strategies like we were talking about in previous module, but also on strong legal frameworks. Laws and regulations provide the authorities for government, agencies, and organizations to act during emergencies, to allocate resources efficiently, and to coordinate response efforts. This module examines key legal frameworks across the world, highlighting how they structure responsibility, powers, and coordination in disaster and emergency management. Understanding this framework is essential for disaster management professionals to operate effectively, to comply with regulations, and to support public safety. Now, let's look at the global legal landscape. Let's look at disaster management laws. Disaster management laws vary widely across countries and is influenced by governance structures, socio-economic conditions, and public policy. Now, let's look at some of the key global standards. We have they define the roles and responsibility. That is clear assignment of responsibility to government agencies, first-time responders, and organization. They establish coordination, laws that ensures multi-agency cooperation through defined communication channels and command hierarchies. They also give authorizing emergency powers. Governments are granted powers to take swift actions, enforce evacuations, and mobilize resources. There's also public safety and accountability. Legal frameworks ensure that public safety is prioritized while maintaining oversight and accountability. Let's look at the next. We have USA. We have what they call FEMA and Stanford Acts. This is the act that governs emergency and disaster management in the USA. Now, what's FEMA? FEMA is Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they are responsible for coordinating disaster management effort at the federal level in the United States. What are the responsibilities? Disaster planning, emergency response coordination, and public education. They also administer disaster relief funds and mitigation programs. Then we have the next, which is the Stanford Act of 1988. This is another statutory regulation in the USA that grants the US government authority to provide federal assistance during disasters. Now, the key features is disaster declaration procedures contained in this act. There's federal financial and technical support, and there's mitigation programs. An example is the Hurricane Katrina that happened in 2005. It highlighted both the strength and challenges of FEMA's coordination under the Stanford Act. Now we have Canada. Canada called theirs the Emergency Act of 1988. And this replaced the War Measures Act, and it provides the legal foundation for federal action during national emergency. Now, some of the key features of this Canada Emergency Act is that it authorizes the federal government to take necessary measures while respecting civil liability or liberties. It covers public welfare, public order, and international emergencies. It also covers coordination in terms of promoting cooperation between federal, provincial, and municipal governments. An example where Canada employed this was the Ontario flooding. The Emergency Act enabled efficient resource deployment while ensuring oversight and public accountability. We have the next, which is the Australia States and Territory Emergency Management Act. Now, this is both handled by the federal and states. This is Australia Disaster Management, and they operate through the state and territory level, like I said. Now, what are the key features? There is decentralized authority. Each state and territory is responsible for its own disaster planning, emergency coordination, and community preparedness. Now, for federal coordination, the Australian Government Crisis Coordination Centre provides support through nationwide emergencies. So this is what happens at the federal level. Now, an example of the deployment of this was the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season, where the State Emergency Act enabled local authority to coordinate evacuations, while federal support facilitated interstate resource deployment. Now, for the UK, we have the Civil Contingency Act of 2004. Now, the Civil Contingency Act (CCA) provides the legal framework for emergency preparedness and response in the UK. Now, we have Category 1 and Category 2. Now, for Category 1 responders, we have emergency services, we have local authorities, we have NHS, and other agencies responsible for direct response, right? Then we have Category 2 responders. These are utilities, transport services, and essential service providers who provide disaster response. Now, the key requirement here is number one, we have risk assessment. There's emergency planning and business continuity arrangement. There is powers to declare emergency and coordinate multi-agency responses. These are the key requirements here. Now, an example is the severe flooding in England that happened in 2004. The CCA 2004 enabled coordinated responses, ensuring the continuity of essential services by creating these Category 1 responders and Category 2 responders. Now, let's look at Nigeria. Now, for Nigeria, we have the NEMA Act. NEMA Act is the National Emergency Management Agency. It coordinates disaster preparedness responses and recovery efforts in Nigeria. Now, the mandate is to develop national disaster policies, coordinate federal and state resources, and collaborate with international agencies during humanitarian crisis. Now, what are some of the powers of NEMA, the NEMA Act? It is empowered to issue directives, coordinate evacuations, and mobilize resources. An example was 2012 Nigeria flooding, where NEMA coordination efforts involved evacuations, relief distribution, and collaboration with international partners, showcasing the importance of legal authorities in disaster management. Now, let's look at the EU. The EU is European Union, the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, UCPM. The UCPM ensures cross-border cooperation among EU member states for disaster management. The purpose is to enhance prevention, preparedness, and coordination across Europe. This was the purpose of the UCPM. The key features was that there was rapid deployment of emergency response team and medical aid. There was technical expertise, sharing, and joint training programs. Then there is financial support for disaster recovery, mitigation programs, and infrastructural rebuilding. An example of where it was deployed was the Southern Europe forest fires, where the UCPM was activated to pool resources for an efficient response, including shared firefighting efforts. Now, by way of conclusion, legal frameworks provide the foundation for effective disaster management, defining roles, responsibilities, powers, and coordination mechanisms. Understanding these frameworks, ranging from the US Stanford Act to the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, it enables disaster professionals to operate efficiently, coordinate multi agency responses, and ensure public safety. Knowledge of legal structure is therefore essential for both planning and executing effective emergency disaster or emergency management strategies worldwide. This module covered all of this. Now, for the assessment, there is a 15 multiple choice question that you have to answer to test your knowledge, and there's a short report that will evaluate a real world scenario where you will submit to test your knowledge of this module. So that's it. I'll see you in the next module.